last week and asked about the book It's Up to You by Ernest Holmes. It was featured in the video I showed last week. We have them in the bookstore, so know that those are there. This week, the topic of my talk is loving what is. So this is the month of February, and so the theme all month long is all you need is love. And so this week, we're talking about loving what is. And this is based on the book by Byron Katie. And again, quick commercial, these are for sale out at the bookstore in the lobby if you don't already own one. But this book is a great book about coming to terms with reality. Coming to terms with reality and loving what is. I think that sometimes in metaphysics we fall into a trap. And the trap is that if we don't like our reality, we deny it, we think, and live in some other reality. Now, this is a tricky thing to walk because we have to love what is before we can create the new reality. Anything else is kind of just delusional. So I know that sometimes we don't want to face what is because we don't like it and it feels bad. So we think if we just think better thoughts, we can change it. But the point of Byron Katie's book is that we can't change anything until we deal with what is. And it's when we look at what is that then we can create the conditions that we want and the reality that we want. It's not by hiding from it. And so that is what we're going to talk about today, is loving what is. Many of us resist what is. And it's because we think it should be a different way. We have come to believe stories that say that things in the world should happen one way or the other. Right? And we just take them as gospel truth, even though they fly in the face of what we witness in our existential reality. Like, everyone should be nice to each other. Don't we think that's the way it should be? I mean, if I walked up to you and said, shouldn't people be nice to each other? You'd all say yes. Are people nice to each other all the time? Are you nice to everyone all the time? So that's not what is. That's just a story we tell ourselves. And so when people are nice, we get all tooled up because they should be. And we cause ourselves misery by thinking that people should be different than they are, rather than dealing with what is. Byron Katie's story is really interesting. She was a youngish mother. She was in her mid-30s and had 3 children. And she had just spiraled out of control down that spiral of depression to the point where she was bedridden and suicidal. Couldn't even go out. She was so depressed. And they were on the brink of institutionalizing her. When one day she had this epiphany that the reason that she was so miserable was not because of the conditions in her life. She thought the reason she was unhappy was because everything out here was so bad. And she had this momentary flash where she realized that the reason she was unhappy was not because of all of this, but because of the way she thought about all of this. Because of the story she was telling herself about the conditions of her life and how they should be different. And when she finally realized that they just are what they are, and they're going to be what they're going to be, she found this amazing peace. It was one of those spontaneous healing moments where she found this amazing peace and she could move forward into her life with a whole new perspective, not wanting to fight against reality. And she says, as you know, Jeff read and I put in the email that went out, all of our suffering comes from fighting what is. She tells this wonderful story about how we get these stories in our head. Because we're all told as kids the way it's supposed to be, right? I mean, we have these canons like everyone should be nice to each other, or, you know, children should respect their parents. How many of you respected your parents the entire time of your life, right? How many of your children respect you all the time? I mean, that's one of those stories that it's an idealized version of what is. So the way we get that is because that's the way we want it to be, but not necessarily what is. Byron Katie tells this great story about her 3-year-old grandson. He was a huge Star Wars fan, and so she went and bought him a Darth Vader doll that he wanted for Christmas. And the Darth Vader doll talked. You did certain things, and it would say phrases to you. You know, you've all seen those toys, right? And so this one had a phrase, and the little boy would do something, and it would say, impressive, but you're still not a Jedi. In Darth Vader's voice, you know.
But still not a Jedi.
So one day after the boy had this little while, Byron Katie calls and talks to her grandson on the phone. He's 3, and says, "How are you doing?" He goes, "Fine, Grandma, but I'm still not a Jedi." And she thinks about this for a while, and every time she talked to him, she said, "How are you?" "Well, I'm still not a Jedi." So she gets this idea. She had a friend who owned a private jet and had invited her to go on a ride. So she talks to her friend about this. She takes her grandson with her on the jet ride. So they go, and while they're up in the air, she gets her friend, the pilot, to say the little boy's name and say, "Congratulations, you are now a Jedi." They ran. They had the whole crew standing there cheering for the little boy because he's now a Jedi. And so Byron Katie says to him when they get in the car, she goes, "So what do you think?" And he didn't say anything. He was quiet. As soon as they got home, he ran into his room. He hit the Darth Vader doll that said, "Impressive, but you're still not a Jedi." And he came and said, "I'm still not a Jedi, Grandma." How many of us have this happen? How many of us have a list of achievements as long as our arm, but because our mother, father, sister, brother, teacher doesn't recognize them, we don't recognize them? How many of us live with those stories inside of us that fly in the face of what is? So the first thing we have to do to love what is we have to explore our judgments. We have to actually embrace our judgments. And many of us don't do that because one of the stories we tell ourselves is we shouldn't judge, right? Judge not. You shouldn't judge. You shouldn't judge. Don't judge. Guess what? We do. I have a joke. I hate judgmental people. Thank you. We do. We have judgments all the time, and they're related to those stories. People should be nice to each other. It's just a judgment. Or outlined like, people should be nice to each other, and you're not being nice to me, so you're wrong. Now, we don't say that because we're all spiritual, right? We're all spiritual here. We all know these principles, so we're not going to say that because we shouldn't judge. So we can't do anything about them because they just operate below our level of awareness. So the first thing we have to do to love what is, we have to bring these judgments up into the light so we can see them. So in the process that Katie outlines in her book, she calls it the work. And the first thing you do is you fill out a Judge Your Neighbor worksheet. And she asks you to fill this out and be as petty and awful as you can possibly be, because it's already operating inside of you. The fact that you're writing it on paper doesn't mean you're not thinking it, you're not feeling it. It means you're bringing it up so that you can deal with it. And so she says, write it out. Write it as awful as you can get. Whatever it is you think it should be. And then come to the end of that and write a sentence about what you are thinking about that. What is the core issue under all of this? So I was thinking about an example, and I tell all this with permission because it's not actually a real example. So don't everybody go up to my husband and talk to him about this because this is not a real example, but I have his permission to tell it. But let's say, and he doesn't do this again, but let's say Steve never picked up his socks, okay? He's very neat, but let's just say. And let's say that I have a belief that husbands should pick up their socks. And let's say that this really bothered me, and I went to Steve and I said, you know, I work really hard to keep the house clean, and the fact that you don't pick up your socks really bothers me. And if you really loved me, you would pick up your socks. So do you mind picking up your socks? And he said, okay, I'll pick up my socks. And he still didn't pick up his socks. So now I probably got all this judgment about this, right? Steve doesn't, you know, he should pick up his socks, he should keep his agreements, he should listen to me, he should do. Now, we all do this. Y'all looking pious at me like, I have no idea what she's talking about. We all do this. We just do it below the level we're willing to admit. So what I would do if I were to do a Judge Your Neighbor worksheet on this is I would write all this down, and at the end, the phrase I would come up with is, if Steve loved me, he would pick up his socks. If Steve loved me, he would pick up his socks. If Steve loved me, he would pick up his socks. Now this is a silly example, Let's take a little deeper one. If my mother loved me, she would approve of everything I did. If I were really smart, I'd get all A's. If my friends were real friends, they'd know when I needed to talk. Those are no more true than if Steve loved me, he'd pick up his socks. It's the story you told yourselves about it. So after you do your Judge Your Neighbor worksheet, the next thing you do, she calls the inquiry. The inquiry. And there are 4 questions to the inquiry. The first question is it true? Is it true? If Steve loved me, he'd pick up his socks. I do think this is true. Let's say. I've asked him to. I've told him what it means to me. If he respected and loved me, he would pick up his socks. There are other things like, if my mother loved me, she'd have gone to my school play. Or whatever it is for you. Is it true? Now, with many of these, we can immediately, as soon as we ask that first question, we can see the fallacy of our reasoning. We usually don't have to get beyond that. But let's say that we do. We say, yeah, that is true. So question number 2. Can I be absolutely certain that it's true? Maybe Steve's mother showed love by leaving his socks all over the floor, and that's how he shows love, is leaving socks. You know, like a little dog. Do your dogs or cats ever bring you dead animals to show how much you love them? Maybe it's something like that. I don't know. But can I really be sure that that's true? My premise. Can I really be sure it's true? Usually by the time you get here, you recognize that you can't. That we don't know what's going on in anyone else's head or heart. We have no idea what their makeup is. This is the story that we have bought into in the race consciousness. These are the judgments that we've developed through the course of our lives. These are the opinions that we formed. And they have nothing to do with what's operating in someone else's head. The third question in the inquiry. How do I react when I have this thought? So if I walk into the bedroom and there's socks on the floor, and my thought is activated, if Steve loved me, he'd pick up his socks, how do I react? I might withhold my love. Oh, he didn't love me enough to pick up his socks. Fine, I won't unload the dishwasher. So I might get resentful and vindictive. I might leave my socks on the floor just to make him mad. All of it. Now, I'm using this ridiculous example, as I hope you all understand, because we all have the deeper ones, and they're different for all of us. I had a belief that about mothers, and when my mom never came to any of my school plays, I knew she didn't love me enough. I knew it. I mean, what kind of a mother doesn't go to her kids' school plays, really? Well, I'll tell you the kind. The kind who's dealing with a sick husband, working full-time, financial crisis. The kind who just is at the end of her rope and can't give anymore. That's what kind of a mother didn't come. One who was doing the best she could with what she had. How did I react when I had the thought that she didn't love me enough to come to my school plays? I ran away. They don't love me. I'm not wanted here. Who would stay where they're not wanted? None of this is true. I couldn't be sure it was true. How did I react? I reacted out of that place of woundedness that I created in my own mind by my own story. And we all do it. And then the fourth question in the inquiry is, who would I be if I didn't have this thought? Who would I be if I didn't have this thought? And there's a corollary to that. Can I think of one positive reason to keep this thought? One stress-free positive reason to keep this thought? The answer is no. You gotta let it go. You gotta let it go. So after you pull up all of your judgments and come to your sentence and then do these 4 questions. Is it true? Can I absolutely be sure it's true? How do I react when I have this thought? And who would I be without this thought, i.e., can I let it go? Do you do the inquiry? Then the third thing she has you do is what's called the turnaround. You look at the thought and you turn it around in at least 3 ways. So, if Steve loved me, he'd pick up his socks. What about if I loved me, I'd pick up my socks? What about if I loved Steve, I'd pick up Steve's socks? What about Steve loves me no matter what happens with socks? Are any of those more or less true than my initial premise? If Steve loved me, he'd pick up his socks? They're not more true, they're not less true, they're just a different way of phrasing it. So in the turnaround, you take your initial premise and you turn it around at least 3 ways. If my mother loved me, she'd come to my school play. If I loved my mother, I would have asked her to come to my school play. If my mother loved me, she'd have taken care of herself first. If I loved me, I'd have let it all go years ago. These are turnaround statements. Because the truth is we can't argue with what is. People don't act the way we want them to act. Things don't happen the way we want them to happen all the time. What Ernest Holmes tells us is that this is something that is operating through us at the level of the subconscious. And that I think the fallacy that I talked about in the opening is that we think that if we don't bring it up to our conscious awareness, we aren't giving it any energy. But that's not true. It is still operating below our level of awareness. It is still impacting our relationships, our friendships, the way we operate, who we deal with, how we deal with it. And when that happens, we just get angry at what is. And there's no reason for that, because what is, just is. So instead of controlling the conditions out here in our life and wanting people to be nice to each other and mothers to love their children and husbands to pick up their socks and whatever else it is in your world, it's better to just say, either I live with dirty socks or I get divorced. Okay, well, I'm not going to get divorced, so I live with dirty socks. And again, Steve is very neat. When we were talking about this, he's like, you let them know that I'm a really neat person. I would tell them that he's a neat freak and that our house is beautifully organized and there are no socks on the floor. So the first thing we have to do is we have to examine our judgments. And if any of you are interested, you can go to Byron Katie's website. Just Google Byron Katie to work. And you can download the Judge Your Neighbor worksheet. And she asks you in that to be as petty and awful as you can be. Because nobody's going to see it but you. And the truth is, those thoughts are operating. We feel weird writing down those childish, awful things. We feel awful doing it because we've been conditioned not to. But she says, do it. Write it down. Write, poopy face, whatever. And she says, be as childish and whatever as you can. That's where the power is. So examine your judgments. And then go through the inquiry for 4 questions. Is it true? Can I be absolutely sure it's true? How do I react when I believe this story? And who would I be without this thought? And then turn it around. Because the opposite is no more or less true than what you believed. And when we can do that, we can embrace what is, we can love what is, and we can love people for who they are. We talk so much about unconditional love, and yet all of our love seems to be conditioned on people acting in accordance with our stories. But if we can let go of that story, then we can love people as they are, and we can love conditions the way they are, and we can love reality as it is, and most importantly, we can love ourselves for who we are. Because I really should be 6 feet tall. If my mom hadn't smoked when I was a baby, I would. love what is. I'm also supposed to have one more there, but that's not. Love what is. So as we move into February, this month of love, let's start by looking around us and projecting that love that's within us to what is. Let's pray. So we come together here in the one mind. We come together in that cosmic consciousness, that understanding that there is only the one that manifests magnificently in this multiplicity of outcomes. We recognize that this mind lives, moves, and has its being as each one of us, beautifully individualized in this cosmic unity. And so as we come together and recognize that there is only this one power and this one presence and this one life that operates through us, that moves through us, and vibrates as us, as we recognize this, we can stand in the truth of knowing that we are one with the divine in exactly the way we are supposed to be. We are expressing perfectly as the unique us, the unique me, the unique I am. There is no need to believe that anything should be different. It is perfect as it is because it is the way it is, and that is all the proof we need. And so I know for each one of us here that as we move into this week, as we move into this day, as we go forward in life, we accept that things just are the way they are. That there is a love that is greater than any condition that we face. We let go of old stories, we let go of old patterns, we let go of old beliefs that make us feel less than, that make us feel separate, that make us feel as if someone is wrong or we are wrong. We just lay those down. And we lift up the truth that life is magnificent exactly as it is. Life is magnificent regardless of what we have been taught in the past to believe about it. And so we move into the rest of our lives now knowing that what is just is. It is what it is. We embrace it. We look at our own judgments and thoughts about it without judgment. Lovingly. Knowing that the world is always supporting us for our greatest learning. And because I embrace what is in this moment, I speak a special word for the big game today, knowing that what will be, and that the highest and best outcome is unfolding for all who are involved. And if that happens to be the Broncos, then I speak a special blessing on the Denver Broncos for this day. And so it is with great gratitude for each person present, for each person whose consciousness joins this joyous co-creative experience of the whole. It is with gratitude for the multiplicity of viewpoints in this community, in this room, in this universe, that I just know that all is well. I know that my words are done even as I speak them. I know that we can create from this point forward, once we embrace all that has been to this point, as what is. And it is from this place that we look ahead to the future, we look ahead to the vision, we look ahead to the magnificence of who we are, and we embrace it and welcome it and allow that divine law and that divine power to bring it to us in that effortless grace and ease. And so from this place of gratitude, I just proclaim that all is well. I let it be so, and so it is.